All right, hello everyone, and welcome to part one of the Planning for a Successful Grazing Season webinar series. My name is Janelle Smith, and I'm a Livestock and Feed Extension Specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture based out of Tisdale. I will be moderating the webinar today. Today's webinar topic is nutrition, how water quality and mineral knowledge can pay off. Our presenters for this webinar are Catherine Lang, a Livestock and Feed Extension Specialist based out of Moose Jaw, and Breanna Anderson, Ag Business Specialist with the Blair's family of companies. Before we begin, I'm going to give a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the presentation, you may type them in the question box in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel, and we will be sure to answer them at the end of each presentation. The two presentations are scheduled to take around 20 to 25 minutes, leaving time for questions at the end. Once we are all done, a link to the recorded webinar will be sent out to all registered participants. So at this time, we will get started. So first off, we have water quality basics with Catherine Lang. Go ahead, Catherine.
As Janelle said, my name is Catherine Lang. I am the Livestock and Feed Extension Specialist at the Ag Knowledge Center in Moose Jaw. And I guess a bit of my background is I grew up on a mixed farm outside of Kalonze, which is east of Saskatoon. I have worked in Moose Jaw since June of 2019, but I've been with the ministry since the fall of 2018. And today we're going to dive into some water quality and some testing things that are important. So to begin, we know that water is the most important nutrient, and a lactating beef cow can consume 50 to 60 liters per day. Now, when I was in university, Dr. Bart Lardner said, water is the most important nutrient, and I wasn't sure I believed him then, but now working in the ministry and seeing the difference that poor water quality makes on herds, it most certainly is the most important nutrient. So poor water impacts water intake, which impacts feed intake, which impacts growth and milk production, which in the end impacts pounds in the fall. It also interacts with the absorption and use of other nutrients. So as you can see, this web down here is very complicated, and poor water that's high in other minerals complicates this even further. Lastly, and summing all of this together, poor water is going to ultimately affect the productivity and health of your herd. So water quality in southern Saskatchewan has been a huge issue for a long time. These headlines were some of the common ones taken, I found from 2017. It's been a long-standing issue down here and has accounted for a lot of random deaths. But most importantly, or I guess most extreme, was in Shamrock when 200 head of cattle died in a community pasture due to extremely high TDS and conductivity. The TDS of the water that those cattle were consuming was 24,000, and TDS of ocean water is 15,000. So we have some awful water down in this area. This large death sparked a call for action, and producers have been really keen about water testing since then. We have learned through the past 3 years of very rigorous testing that water is extremely variable, even in one single pasture. I've seen a few times that sloughs or dugouts are within 100 feet of each other, and one can be crystal clear, really good water, and the other is in a toxic level. Just the other day, I tested 2 wells. One was a north well and one was a south well within 250 feet of each other. One was toxic, one was perfectly fine. So the variability really causes the need for this water testing that I'm going to talk about today. So with that, I want to cover the 5 W's and 1 how of water testing. So the who should do it, what to do with it, being the sample, where to take it, when to test, why should sampling be done, and how to take a sample. So hopefully we already know that anyone with livestock should be the ones who are doing water testing. And it should be done, hopefully we've already answered that we've got a lot of variability, that it's really harmful to cattle and other livestock, but I'm going to get further into what each of those minerals do in a bit here. So let's jump into the piece of water testing. So when to test water is a question that we often get, and the best answer is to do it regularly. So do it after the spring runoff. Do it throughout the summer, especially if you get little rainfall, or in the spring if you get little runoff. Also, if there's any changes in color, smell, or appearance, and if there's any symptoms that are suspicious detected in the animals. The most important thing to do with testing is to figure out your baseline. So if you know where you're starting at, we can then prioritize or help you prioritize which dugouts to use or sloughs to use at the beginning of the season, and then which to hang on to a little bit longer when that evaporation happens. So here, wells and dugouts, we'll talk about that for a second. So wells are much more stable than dugouts. Wells are underground, they don't really get affected too much by the temperature changes that we have, but dugouts and sloughs can be very, very, very variable. Dugouts need to be tested much more frequently because they get rainfall, but they also get evaporation. And on those hot days, a lot of water disappears really quickly, which leaves behind the more concentrated solution left in that water. The next question I get is how to take a sample. So the sample that we look for is a representative and fresh. We ideally need 1 liter of sample from the drinking end. So what I mean by the drinking end is where the animals are drinking from. So if you have a watering bowl, for example, take it from where the water comes into the watering bowl, not from the faucet, because there could be something underground contaminating that water. If you have a dugout, the easiest thing to do I guess the most representative thing to do would be to take from where they drink. So cows often take 1 to 2 steps into the water and then drink. When I was out sampling with a producer, what we did is we took a grain sampling stick and reached in roughly that far and then dumped it into our sample container. I've heard of other people taping like red Solo cups to a hockey stick and using that to reach in so you don't get so muddy and wet. But most importantly, it needs to be put into a clean container. So over the years of doing this, I've seen all kinds of containers. Mason jars work really good because they are glass and are quite clean. Water bottles are nice. The 500 mils, bring me 2 of them, and then we've got that liter that we need. I've seen milk jugs and juice jugs and Gatorade containers. Anything that holds water works. Just please make sure that it's clean and rinsed out really, really well. Or you can use these sample bottles. So there's 2 here that we have at all of our regional offices. They are free to take. So if you're looking to have the specific jug ready, these are sterile and ready to go. You're welcome to come into the office and pick them up. The next question is what to do with that sample. So you've gone out of your way to go and get that sample taken from your dugout or your slough. Now what do you do with it? So bring it to your Ministry of Agriculture regional office because we have free water testing services from a partnership with the Roy Romano Lab in Regina. So we are able to test water for livestock producers free of charge. The only requirements for this is that you do have to have your premise ID or your PID. If you have any questions on that, throw it in the questions box and I'll address that at the end. And it has to be for livestock only. So unfortunately, we can't do this water testing for spray water or for water for irrigation. We are able to do a pre-screening in office. So when you bring it into our office, we're able to measure conductivity. So now you may be asking, what is conductivity? So conductivity essentially is the water's ability to carry an electric charge, which comes from the dissolved minerals in that water. Conductivity will increase as the amount of minerals that are dissolved in that water increase. So we can use that conductivity to estimate what the sulfates or the TDS will be. Because TDS is total dissolved solids, and we're measuring with conductivity the minerals that are in that water. However, it's not consistent enough to relate to TDS. And lots of times when producers are coming in, they ask me what the TDS is. And unfortunately, we don't give that out because the different ions carry electricity differently. So if we have, say, more calcium and less sulfates, it's going to read totally different than if it was the reverse. So that conversion can be anywhere from 0.6 to 1.15 for the TDS. So when we are talking conductivity, we have a range that we tend to follow because we can expect sulfates to be typically 40 to 60% of conductivity. However, that can change drastically depending on your sample. So we try to stay within that ballpark as a pre-screening tool, but we will never tell you right away if it's in that questionable range that it's fine without sending it off to the lab. So that takes me into our next piece here. So this hand meter versus the lab analysis. So these hand meters, you can either purchase them, I know for sure, at the Southwest Animal Health Center in Swift Current, or I looked online on Amazon before here, and they are online there. There's lots of different options, but the blue one on the end was about $80. These handheld meters can be a really good screening tool on farm, but they only give you that one, conductivity, and two, the TDS. But we already know that that TDS is likely going to be inaccurate because these are programmed for fairly decent water, and the water that we have in Saskatchewan, unfortunately, is not exactly decent water. So as you can see on the other end, on that lab analysis, they give us much more information and a breakdown to understand what's actually dissolved in that water. So we had these screening tools, the blue one on the end, as the top graph with the moose jaw portable meter, and the vet clinic also had a portable meter. And this is all credit to Colby Alford. He, and I believe Murray Feist, they tracked these meters. And as you can see, the vet clinic's meter was bang on every time. The moose jaw meter, however, as the water got worse, it got more inaccurate. And that's really dangerous because when you need to know whether your water is safe or not is when we start to get into those higher levels. So, for example, if your water was actually testing at 6,000, but your meter was reading 2,000, you would assume it's safe to put them in there, when in fact it would actually be at a potentially toxic level there. So the Ministry of Agriculture purchased these lab grade water meters, and every regional office now has one of these meters. And we're able to screen those samples as soon as they come in. And these have been bang on. The 4 that I've done this year so far have been at 101%. So they're pretty much perfect. With these, we can tell you whether your water is really good or really bad and anywhere in between. Some offices send all of them, some send only the ones that are questionable. So it's really important to talk to your livestock and feed extension specialist to see what their plan is for sending them away. And yeah, go from there. So screening with these probes, the hand meters really are a screening tool, but the quality is variable. Again, on our big ones, the accuracy is quite high, but on those little ones that you have on a farm, it's not a bad idea to be probing them on farm and send them off to the lab and see how close your meter is and be able to account for that variability. But the lab test really is the gold standard. So some of those things we get on the lab test, I'm going to go through right now. So I called them components to keep an eye on. So the first one is nitrates. So our cautionary limit for nitrates is anything under 100 we can recommend for use. However, usually we find these in wells, and usually it's because they're downhill and are collecting manure runoff. So when there's nitrates, often bacteria go hand in hand. Often we're recommending to build up those wellheads and to do a shot chlorination if we're seeing high nitrates, and that generally starts to resolve the problem. Anything over 100, we really have to be careful so that our total diet concentration of nitrates doesn't exceed 0.5 of the total ration. So we need to avoid high nitrate feeds. So just a recap of what those high nitrate feeds are is any plant, especially a cereal crop that has gone through a period of stress before cutting. So that could be a frost, a hail, a drought, or actually this year we saw one that was a heat stress. So the crop was cut on a +30 day and just tested for nitrates as just to see, and it actually came back extremely toxic. So anytime that plant goes through stress, those nitrates are a possibility, and if you're mixing them with those high nitrate waters, you could have an issue. Another thing that we keep an eye on is sodium. So 800 milligrams per liter is the upper limit. Once we start to see high sodium, then we start to see it goes hand in hand with reduced feed intake, reduced water intake, and reduced mineral intake. So generally, when your water's high in sodium, it's also high in sulfates. So having a decreased mineral intake is not ideal because you're wanting to have those minerals in there to build up their status. Breanna is going to get into more of that in the next presentation, so I'll leave it there. But they'll also get reduced water intake because their salt craving isn't being quenched. So they're drinking the water because they're thirsty, but then they're remaining thirsty. And then if they're not drinking enough water, they're also not drinking enough or eating enough feed. The high sodium is also going to cause diarrhea. So again, these animals aren't thriving as well as they could be. Another component to keep an eye on is iron. So iron is usually a nuisance problem. However, iron really affects palatability and can reduce intake. It also interacts with other elements and it can bind with other elements to impact metabolism. So that complicated graph that I showed you at the beginning, iron is one of those elements that can get tied up and potentially make problems worse. So the maximum for iron we like to suggest is 10 milligrams per liter, but this could be a big problem in horses. I am sticking to beef cattle, but horses and high iron go hand in hand for some issues. So if you have questions on that, let me know after. Last but not least, the one that everyone talks about is sulfates. So sulfates are essentially excess sulfur in the water that the cattle are consuming. And it's going to affect metabolic interferences or direct toxicity. With the metabolic interferences, the sulfur interacts with the trace minerals that can lead to trace mineral deficiencies. With the direct toxicity is if you have excess sulfur, it impairs thiamine, which can then lead to polio. The most detrimental and potentially costly effect are those metabolic interferences. And that comes from our trace mineral deficiencies. So when trace minerals are deficient, we have issues with fertility, weight gain, and immunity. So fertility, you may find animals that are slow to cycle or don't cycle at all, or bulls with inadequate sperm production. For those calves, you might see a weight gain, even in cows, that their metabolism just isn't quite as good as it could be. Feed intake is decreased and water intake is decreased, and immunity. So you may see more incidences of foot rot or pink eye. The trouble with these costs of sulfates is how do we quantify what the cost of sulfates are? So I don't have an answer for that, it's just a point to ponder. The most common issue with sulfates is the secondary copper deficiency. So what I'm going to talk about here has been a real case in Saskatchewan in a feedlot setting. So here, multiple animals were showing signs of decreased performance. As you can see, this cow here, she's got classic copper deficiency. She's got rough, poor quality hair that has that orangey tinge. She's also got poor growth and a low body condition score. At the feedlot, they found that high sulfur was in the water. So they put the animals all on a chelate of copper, and the entire herd showed improvement. 3 months later, this photo was taken, and you can see her hair is returned back to the proper color and texture, and she's gained back weight and body condition score and just overall looks healthier. So this is pretty severe, but again, it was all linked back to that high sulfate water. So where are the limits for sulfates? So anything under 500 is really good to go. And that 500 to 1,000, we can recommend that for use, but your cattle really do have to be on a mineral. Here, a sulfate mineral would be okay, but no mineral is not an option. Once we get into that 1,000 to 2,000 range, I would say use, but use with caution. So our Saskatchewan guideline limit is 1,000. However, we know we can push that to 2,000, and if we had our limit at 1,000, there would be hardly any water for cattle to use. So in this range, a trace mineral supplement is absolutely necessary, and the performance of your cattle are likely to decline. Once we hit that 2,000 mark, we cannot recommend for livestock use anymore, because even a chelated trace mineral cannot keep up to the binding that's happening. Here we have a risk of polio. Actually, on naive animals, polio can happen above 1,000, and just that health status of that animal is going to decline. So this is a fun picture here. So these are actual sulfate levels that were taken at Old Wives the summer of 2016. So looking at this, you would guess that jugs 1 and 2 that are more clear would be the good water, and then as we got farther along and the jugs got darker, that they would be of poor quality. However, this is what they actually were. So the darker jugs in this case were the ones that had low sulfates, and the clearer ones had really high sulfates. And this picture shows why it is so important to get your water tested, because looking at it, you would see crystal clear water, think it's good to go, but in reality, that number 2 can no longer be used for livestock, for cattle specifically. I've got a few more graphs to show you here. So these are credit to Murray Feist, Colby, Elford, and Leah Clark. I can't take any credit for this. I wasn't even working for the ministry then, but here we are. So this was in 2017 when they started doing water sampling and collecting a lot of data. In 2017, nearly half of the samples that were brought in were not acceptable for livestock use, and the other half were either good or in that cautionary level. Now, when we go into 2018, there was 700 samples brought in, and only 22% were in that toxic range, and over half were in that really good range. Now, two things that kind of happened here. One, it doesn't likely mean that less dugouts are bad. It probably means that producers knew which ones were toxic and were no longer bringing us those samples, and were instead fencing out those pieces. And two, we did get a little bit more rain early on. Then it got really dry, and then it rained again in the fall. So hard to say, but lots of this is coming from those producers no longer testing the ones that they know are bad. And then this was in 2019, so we had nearly 500 samples brought in, and the numbers didn't change much. So looking at this, it's probably safe to say that especially in that Moose Jaw area, nearly a quarter of all the water that's brought in is not safe for livestock use. So speaking of sulfates, I'm sure lots of you heard about the sulfate project that happened at the LFCE, the Livestock and Forage Center of Excellence at Clavette. Dr. Greg Penner put this on in conjunction with Leah Clark and Colby Elford and their two master students, Jordan Johnson and Brittany Sutherland. So in this trial, they had 32 Hereford cross heifers that were in 2 blocks. They were stalled in individual stalls in a climate-controlled barn. So this is really important to remember. They got a week to adapt to the water, and then were on their water for 10 weeks. Dry matter intake and water intake were summarized by a week. Body weight was, they were weighed every 2 weeks, and blood was collected at the start and the end of the study. So how this worked, now this is, again, just what they were consuming. So how this worked is they had these tubs set out here where they were mixing sodium sulfate into these tubs to make the proper concentration. They have these individual pumps that pumped the water into the specific stalls. So here are the heifers in their individual stalls. They all got individual feed and individual water. This was a really cool experiment because it's the first time that they have done individual water to the animals, I think ever. So that was really cool. They could measure intake per animal. The heifers, again, they were in individual stalls in a climate-controlled barn, and they were given the forage ration. So these are some of the things that the study found. So it was replicated twice. Basically, when they had increasing sulfates, the dry matter decreased, or it stayed relatively the same, but at the 3,000 mark, it dropped way off. How it affected dry matter, how water intake was, it was a greater water intake at 0 and 2,000 sulfates. So it was cubic. The impact of water on dietary sulfur. So this is calculating the total sulfur in the ration. So obviously, as you put more sulfates in the water, the higher proportion of their ration is sulfur. And then here is the impact of water on serum copper. So copper serum decreased with every increase in sulfates. And this is really important to know because that means there's less copper in their blood as they are consuming higher sulfate water. So again, some acknowledgements. So the Strategic Field Program was funded through the Canadian Agriculture Partnership and the Ministry of Agriculture. And we had support from the Roy Romano Lab for doing the water testing. The next steps from this trial, so we saw some things, but Really, we didn't see quite enough to make any major changes to what we're recommending. So we do have another trial lined up for the summer of 2021, and we're using heifers that are housed outdoors with limited shelter to simulate pasture. We're going to try to use natural high TDS water to account for everything else increasing. So in that last one, when they increased sulfates, they were only adding sodium sulfate. They weren't adding all of the other things that come with poor water quality. And we're going to look at copper in both the blood and doing liver biopsies. So liver biopsies are important because that's where copper gets stored. So there is the free copper in the blood, but there's also the copper that's stored in the liver. So we're going to be able to look at both of those this time and see if it impacts the overall copper reserves. So with that, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here, and we're going to look at some other parameters of water quality, since that's what we're covering today. So algae and bacteria, so they can be an indicator of water quality. So algae grows really rapidly in warm, stagnant water that's high in nutrients. And smelly bacteria can persist in water in the winter months when there's anaerobic bacteria and nutrients present. So the two types of algae that we get a lot of questions on are green algae and blue-green algae. So just in general, green algae would be the stringy algae. So it sticks to your fingers, it's in long pieces, and that's mostly just a nuisance algae. There's not a lot that you need to worry about that. The one that's problematic is blue-green algae, and that's the one that looks like pea soup, like the picture here, or when you stick a gloved hand in there, it looks like paint on your glove. And that's called cyanobacteria, or the blue-green algae, and it can produce neuro or liver toxins. So the neurotoxins are really fast-acting, and they cause paralysis of the animal and then of their respiratory system. The other ones are hepatotoxins, which affect the liver, and they take a little longer for the animal to die, but ultimately they will die either way. Some of the other symptoms are scours, mental derangement, muscle tremors, and stiffness. It's really hard to diagnose these blue-green algae problems. One, because when cattle don't feel good, they tend to go to water to drink to try to reduce a fever. So they may end up dying near the slough, and it wasn't really the slough's fault. They got sick somewhere else and just ended up dying there. And two, if you want to test the water, you have to test it when the bloom is dying, which is a really short window. So even if you're a day and a half later and you find her and then take that water sample, it may not be a high enough toxicity to cause the death. But if you would have been there a day and a half and sampled and sent it off to the lab, it would come back at a toxic level. It's really important to ID before treating. So we want to make sure that it is true bacteria and not good algae. Planktonic or free floating in the water, so like a duckweed. And blue-green algae is free floating in the water, and it can look green to dark brown and even red, like grass clippings or pea soup. So you really want to try to confirm the ID before treating, because you end up with it being duckweed, which is a really beneficial water plant that you don't actually want to kill. So when you have that blue-green algae or anything else in there that you need to treat, there are registered products available. We want to manage to reduce the nutrients. So often the blue-green algae happens because there's some kind of manure or urine getting into the water. So if we're able to fence it out and pump the water out and reduce the nutrient load getting into that water, then the overall load just won't be there. For other things, you can try aeration or dye, but it's really important to do that ID. If you are treating for blue-green algae, please remember to remove your cattle, because the blue-green algae treatment causes the blue-green algae to die, which then causes all of those toxins to be released. So those cattle needed to be removed until the toxins are released, they're flushed away, and then that water is safe for use. So with that, my take-home message to you is to test your livestock water. My phone number is on there. We are working from home these days, so if you want to phone my cell phone or shoot me a text, there's my number. I'd be happy to talk to anyone with questions about this. And if you do want to bring a water sample in to your local livestock and feed extension specialist, You can look them up online at saskatchewan.ca/agriculture. Type in your closest location, and then from there, they'll be able to help you figure out how we're receiving water samples at this time. All offices are still receiving samples, even through the social distancing. It just might look a little different than it has in the past. So with that, I am done for now, unless there are any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine. So right now, if you have any questions, just type them into that question box and I'll go through them all. And in the event that we run out of time or proceed to the next presentation and you think of a question, still shoot it into the question box and we'll make sure it gets answered, whether it's live today or by phone or email afterwards. So our first question is, do you know what is the concern with horses and high iron in water?
I believe it's called hemochromatosis. I'm going to have to double check that, but essentially the iron gets too high that the horse can't secrete all of it, so they get a buildup in iron in their body, which causes them, unfortunately, to die. It takes a lot of iron, but depending on the horse's age and their other feeds, that range, there's a range there. It can be quite low to quite high, and I've seen a few water samples, unfortunately, that are too high to recommend for horses.
Perfect. And I will give about 10 to 15 more seconds just to see if there's any more questions coming in, and then we'll wrap up. All right, so that looks like that will be it for all. So like we said, if you have a question that pops up, don't hesitate to contact Catherine or your local livestock and feed extension on minerals. All right, go ahead, Breanna.
Perfect. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good, Breanna. Go ahead.
Awesome. Skip that out of my way. Awesome. Well, thanks, Catherine and Janelle, for having me on this evening. Today I'll be talking a bit about mineral on pasture, since we're going into that season where we're going to be turning cows out onto pasture. So it's a good time to start thinking of what you may need to be supplementing with on pasture. So since this is like a virtual producer meeting, I love to start off just by introducing myself. It's a bit weird not to see who else would be in the room and get the feedback from the crowd, but either way, like they said, I'm Breanna Anderson. I work with Blair's Animal Nutrition and I'm based out of Saskatoon. I grew up on a cow-calf operation in Swan River, Manitoba, headed west for school, went to school for far too long in Saskatoon, and recently finished my master's in animal nutrition, where I studied corn grazing with Bart Lardner at the Western Beef Development Center. So for the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of working with Blair's Animal Nutrition and have learned a lot and am happy to work with cow-calf producers across Saskatchewan. So tonight, I just wanted to talk a bit about mineral nutrition on pasture and focus kind of on 3 key areas. So first of all, is supplementing mineral necessary on pasture? The importance of ingredients, the importance of understanding the source of the nutrients that you're providing, and then kind of close out with intake is everything, knowing that it's important that what you put in front of the animal, they're actually consuming and hopefully getting a benefit of the nutrient. So why is mineral nutrition important? So we know that stress may reveal subclinical deficiencies and that mineral status is affected by the animal's physiological stage. So are they growing? Are they growing a fetus? Are they lactating? Are they freshly weaned? What's their previous nutrition? Were they on a backgrounding ration? Were they out grazing pasture? Are they on a corn grazing ration? And then what's the mineral availability? So what type of mineral did they have access to, whether it be a mineral supplement or minerals through the forages. So we know that over time you might start to see subclinical and clinical effects of poor mineral nutrition that will all start to affect your bottom line, whether it's a decrease in immunity and enzyme function, which can therefore also decrease the efficacy of the vaccines you're giving your animals, or decrease in growth and fertility. You know, we don't want to see our preg rates declining or open rates increasing. We want to see nice tight calving groups. And for that to happen, we have to make sure that they're set up for success when it comes to breeding time. So we know that both macro and micro minerals are important. I'm not going to go through, you know, what percent or how many grams of calcium a cow needs per day, because it's so variable in terms of what stage of production they are in. And I know you can find that information very easily online, but I just wanted to highlight that we talk about macro minerals, especially calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. They're highly important in things like bone formation, muscle contraction, and lactation. So when we talk about muscle contraction, everything from, you know, moving, standing up, lying down, but you can also think about smooth muscle contraction, you know, returning to estrus after a calving, making sure that we're cleaning out the placenta. We can also talk about microminerals such as copper, zinc, manganese, and selenium. So when Catherine talked about trace minerals, that's where we would kind of highlight the importance of copper, zinc, and manganese on pasture, especially when you have poor quality water. These nutrients are important for fertility, fetal development, hoof integrity, among many others. So like I said, if we aren't meeting these nutrient requirements, we can expect to see, you know, poor reproduction, delayed calving, weak calves, and reduced growth rates. So often these aren't things like, often these things are only measured once a year, right? If you're preg testing and you noticed, hey, I have 2% more open than last year, or at weaning, maybe your calves were 30 pounds lighter. It's really hard to pinpoint when we're seeing these deficiency reduce our overall production, but I think if we get a good handle on a year-round program, we can start to see, you know, little improvements that do make a big effect in the bottom line. So when we're talking about meeting the requirements, I like to break it down that we're talking about, you know, what's in the feed, so the forages, the grain, what's in the mineral supplement, and hopefully the combination of the two can meet the cow's nutrient requirements. So essentially in the feed, you have to think about how much of the feed are they consuming, how much mineral content is actually in that feed, and then what's the availability or the bioavailability of that mineral within the feed. 2, you can also think about what's the source of the mineral, so what's the ingredient that makes up that level, what's the level in the mineral supplement, what's the target intake, and what's the actual intake. So we'll get into these a bit more in detail throughout the presentation. So I guess the first was, do we even need to provide mineral on pasture? Do pasture forages have adequate mineral present? Are these minerals available to the animal? And I guess I asked this question because, you know, as a feed rep, you know, I like to think minerals are important 365 days of the year because that's what would keep me employed, obviously, right? But luckily, the ministry and the Sask Forage Council have actually recently done research in Saskatchewan to look at trace mineral and mineral levels on forages in Saskatchewan, just to kind of give us an overview as to what we're deficient in. And I think that's really important to recognize that, you know, trace mineral and mineral supplementation throughout the summer is important. So what they did is they collected samples throughout Saskatchewan in the spring and fall of 2012 and 2013. And then they tested these samples, and then they could, you know, report what the levels were in these samples. So essentially, some of the forages across Saskatchewan did a decent job at meeting our calcium phosphorus requirements, did a poorer job at meeting the magnesium requirements throughout Saskatchewan. And you can kind of see that, you know, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, you see that phosphorus is higher in the spring, lower in the fall. Magnesium is lower in the spring, higher in the fall, which goes hand in hand. You know, this time of year, we're often talking about making sure there's enough magnesium before you turn cattle out onto pasture, just with the concern of grass tetany. Looking at trace minerals, you can see for the most part, we're very inadequate with zinc and copper. Manganese is kind of hit and miss, just like calcium and phosphorus was. But the interesting one to me is that selenium is met in almost 80% of the samples. However, quite often we get questions about, I need that salt with fortified with selenium, when in reality selenium, yes, it's important, and we think it belongs in a mineral supplement, but it's one of the more available or present sources in our forages in Saskatchewan. So regardless of the level that you see in a feed test or in a pasture feed test, we have to remember that just because the level might be there, how available is that to the animal? So often we talk about bioavailability, and that considers both the absorption and the utilization by the animal. So making sure they can absorb the nutrient and use it in their metabolic functions. So this is just showing that phosphorus is actually fairly available when you take it out of forages. Calcium, not so much. Magnesium, not so much. Sodium, so salt, very well tied up by the forages. So that would be why we have to supplement so much with salt. As you can see here, there's no trace minerals on here, partly due to not as much research maybe in that area, but also we think that those are even bound even tighter. Essentially, the bioavailability of these nutrients in forages, the less digestible the forage is, the less chance you likely will have to extract those nutrients. So for a trace mineral in specific, or trace mineral or a mineral to be available to the animal, it actually has to reach the small intestine. That's where most of our uptake is going to occur. So when nutrients or when minerals are solubilized in the rumen, they might be tied up with some of those anti-nutritional factors that Catherine was talking about. So whether it's high molybdenum in your feed, also entering the rumen at the same time as copper sulfate, those two might bind and now that copper is not available. Or high sulfate waters, that water might bind with some of those available trace minerals in the rumen, and then you'll have less flowing into the small intestine and available for absorption there. Cobalt is actually used in the rumen, especially in high-grain diets, but also it's used for the in reactions that create vitamin B, so it's very important. Zinc sulfate is used by yeast in the rumen, so it also needs a bit going into the rumen, but other than that, our goal should be getting as much copper, zinc, and manganese into the small intestine for absorption. So now I'm just going to talk about 4 key sources of trace minerals on the market. So the first would be oxides, and these would be some of the first used in livestock nutrition. Essentially, they are insoluble, so they don't dissolve at all, hardly. Zinc oxide can be used as an antimicrobial agent. So when you're thinking putting an antimicrobial agent in with the rumen microbes, it's kind of counterintuitive in that we want good rumen bacterial action. They're very stable, but they're not very well absorbed by the animals. They have low bioavailability. Benefit to them is that they're very concentrated, so that you can get a lot of copper into a small area, so that's nice when you're formulating a product, and they're also very inexpensive. So the next one would be sulfates. So in this picture you can see a cow running through a foot bath, and that's because often copper sulfate is used in foot baths, and that's because copper sulfate inhibits bacterial growth, and so it can be used as a fungicide in dugouts or used in foot baths. There's also zinc sulfate, so it's used, it's actually used in the packages of yeast in your freezer that are on a massive short supply right now. Those will have a bit of zinc sulfate in there, and that's as a yeast growth mechanism. So we do need a bit in the rumen, and it has a slightly less antimicrobial effect than copper sulfate. But all in all, they're both very soluble in water, so that when they enter the rumen, they might solubilize, and that is where we could run into issues with them being tied up with anti-nutritional factors from your water or your feed. Sulfates are also have a high concentration like oxides, but they're poorly absorbed by the animal and they have a fairly poor palatability. So if you're looking for a free choice product, it's sometimes very hard to get them to eat enough of it. The next one is chelates or organics. So most people have heard of these. They're a mineral bound to a non-metal entity or a ligand bond. So this ligand bond can be, one specific amino acid or a small number of amino acids, or it can be a random number of amino acids or a combination of the mineral bound to carbohydrates or polysaccharides. Essentially, there are about 6 different forms of chelates on the market, and the quality varies amongst these forms, and so that can affect both the concentration of the nutrient as well as the availability of the trace mineral to the animal. So chelates have a fairly low concentration. So what that means is just when you're trying to formulate it into a product, you need a lot of the ingredient to fill in the need. They are very stable in the rumen, so that's very good. Like Catherine said, if you have high sulfate waters or you have really poor water quality, if you offer them a chelated trace mineral, it will be better absorbed by the animal and it won't tie up with those anti-nutritional factors, and it's highly available to the animal. One con about chelate or organic trace minerals is that they are fairly expensive. So quite often that can be inhibitory as to how much you can include in a formulation. So often, if it's got 2,000 milligrams per kilogram of copper, it would be very expensive to put in 100% as to chelate. So often we'll see it as a 20, 30, 40% inclusion of a chelate. But all in all, a very stable and available source of trace minerals. The final one would be the newest to the livestock market. These have been researched extensively and had been used in the monogastric industry for quite a while, but just have recently become more cost effective to be used in the ruminant nutrition world. So essentially they're very stable, which is positive for when you're not only in the rumen, but also when you're storing a feed ingredient. So they're less oxidated. They have less oxidative destruction of vitamins and less destruction by fats and oils. So essentially, if you have it sitting in a pallet in your shed, it'll be less destructive towards the vitamins in that mineral. Like I said, it's very stable, so it's insoluble in the rumen. So once it passes from the rumen, ends up in the abomasum, the low pH of the abomasum is what cleaves the bond between the copper, the zinc, and the hydroxy molecule. So now once it's in the small intestine, it is picked up as the mineral. The nice thing with these is that they're very concentrated and they have a specific and predictable size. So that just means it's very consistent going into the product. And this specific and predictable size is a benefit when you are weatherizing a product that we might mention later on. Another benefit to these is that they are very tasty. They have excellent palatability, and they would be a moderate cost. So they're not as expensive as chelates. They are more expensive than a sulfate or an oxide, but because they're not quite as expensive as a chelate, you can actually include them at much higher levels to hopefully get a better bioavailability of your whole mineral package. So just if we were to compare, a hydroxy source compared to a copper source, it's nearly twice the availability. And I would put chelates, kind of right next to there. It would depend obviously on the chelate source, because like I said, there's about 6 different ways you can make a chelate. But for the most part, if you're going to compare hydroxys and chelates to a sulfate source, they are more available to the animal. I just wanted to mention magnesium as well. Magnesium's often in the shadow. We often concern ourselves with calcium, phosphorus, and the trace minerals, but especially at this time of year, magnesium is really important. It plays a close role with calcium, phosphorus. So most magnesium sources are magnesium oxide. So if we If we need to increase the level of magnesium this time of year into minerals, quite often you actually see a decrease in intake because it's has very poor palatability. It's very concentrated, but it has a low absorbability. So we're talking about 30% might be picked up by the animal. Whereas you can use a calcium magnesium carbonate source. It's commonly used in the dairy industry and has been for years. It's essentially very highly available, very palatable. When we talk about availability, it's closer to 93% available to the animal. So it's just another alternative source that you might see in some products that have a better availability to the animal. So vitamins, essentially vitamins are more available in lush growing forages than preserved forages. So we do like to see them in a mineral supplement this time of year, but they're often not included at as high of levels as a winter feeding mineral. Just a comment on sources of vitamin E. Essentially, synthetic vitamin E is the most common source, and it's a good source of vitamin E. There is a new source of vitamin E out there, and it's soybean derived, and it's a natural source, and essentially it's just better absorbed in the liver and it's retained longer in the tissue. So it's just another way that you can ensure that they are getting adequate uptake of the nutrient. The other thing that we talk about this time of year with producers is when they call me and they say, I want a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1 or a 4-to-1, they're shocked if I don't have one that's a strict ratio of a 2-to-1 anymore. And the reason for that might be that phosphorus is actually very expensive. So what I would challenge producers to is to look at the phosphorus level and think, do I truly need that much phosphorus? Because if you remember back to the bioavailability chart at the start, phosphorus is fairly available in our forages, and we often have decently high levels of phosphorus in our forages, so we might not need to put it in as high of levels as we once thought we did. So the 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 ratio that we lived and breathed for so many years was originally discovered because when you broke down a carcass of an animal, the bone structure is made 2 parts calcium, 1 part phosphorus. So that's where that comes from. But we know that we can, hit a ratio of anywhere from 1-to-1 to 7-to-1. And at the end of the day, the main thing is to balance for the right amount of calcium and the right amount of phosphorus in the diet. So this graph is just showing that along the top here, you can see the percent of phosphorus in a forage, and then on the bottom, moving down here, on the left-hand side is the stage of production. So essentially, depending on the level of your forage, you can kind of predict how much you actually need to be supplementing. And I would say lots of the pasture in the fall time is kind of on near the right-hand side. So you actually don't need a whole lot of phosphorus. When you get into the fall time, you might need to be supplementing a bit more as it becomes less available. So if you are using a loose mineral product, a loose free choice product, there are many types of weatherization processes out there. And they usually, yes, they have an added cost, but I think by the time you're spending the money to put all those expensive ingredients together, that a couple bucks a bag to ensure that the products aren't blowing away or washing away is well worth it. Because we all know that when it turns into a kind of a soupy cement-like mess at the bottom and you have to dump it out, that was a really expensive, dump out of a pail type thing. So just a comment about reading tags. I would encourage, don't compare apples to oranges. It never hurts to ask your feed rep, what source of copper are you using, what source of manganese is in there. If we're saying that it's chelated, I don't think it hurts to push and say, well, what percent is chelated? Is it 100% or 20%? Or I know as a feed rep, I don't mind getting asked those questions at all. I'm happy to talk through it with the customer because I think it is important to know what you're purchasing and what kind of availabilities might be in there. So like I said, source is important. You don't want to be comparing apples to oranges, you know, at the level with a hydroxy source compared to a copper sulfate source is quite different. Also, another question to ask or another thing to consider is the intake. So if you're comparing, especially if you're getting down to the point where you're comparing in a cost per head per day or a cost per bag, you need to be considering what's the target intake of the product. Is it 40 grams? Is it 100 grams? Is it 40 grams? But then I need to dilute it with salt. So these things all kind of factor into the cost per head per day, as well as the nutrients that or the mineral that they're consuming per head per day. So with these products, I think that intake is number one. So the most expensive product is the one they don't eat. Essentially, you can buy all the bells and whistles, but if they aren't going to eat it and you have to dump it out on the ground, it is incredibly frustrating. We know that cattle essentially have no nutritional wisdom. They have a taste for salt, but that's it, which can run into problems if you do have really high salt water. You may have to look for an alternative mineral source that isn't driven by salt intake. I would say competition will decrease intake. So whether it be a mineral tub, a lick tub, low moisture block, whatever the feeder might be, quite often we're recommending one location per 25 to 30 head. And this is just that you want to make sure that they're getting a chance to access the mineral or the lick tub. And as soon as they kind of get deterred or pushed away, the ones that aren't competitive may not come back and consume some. So just make sure you have enough locations for them. In the summertime, we often say, you know, place it near the water in the summertime because they're coming up a couple times a day for a drink, then they'll consume more that way. And like I said, if you have a high salt content in your water and your forages, you might need to consider, you know, a salt-free mineral or else a low moisture block to encourage intake. So something that uses that doesn't use salt as the driving factor to get them to eat it, essentially. So just some basic math in case anyone wanted to, you know, do a comparison at home, or I would encourage you to, you know, call someone like myself or Janelle or Catherine, and they can help you with this. But essentially, if you're trying to compare two products and they have different intakes, this is kind of the basic math you would do, just looking at, you know, the intake times the level on the tag. So just keeping an eye on your units. Micro minerals are always going to be milligrams per kilogram, whereas macro minerals like salt and calcium will be as a percent. So other considerations, every farm is different. Everyone has a different management style. So do you prefer lick tubs over free choice? You know, free choice requires putting out products, you know, once a week or every couple of days, whereas a lick tub often requires, you know, putting them out there and forgetting about them type thing. The other thing I would ask is, do you want fly control? There are a few products out in the market that have very good claims for fly control. So that'd be something I would ask your feed rep about if that's something you're interested in and something you want to give a try. And then lastly, like Catherine talked about, take into account your water quality. If you do have really poor water quality, that might influence the quality of mineral nutrition you want to supply your animals. It also might influence the intake that you'll see of that product. So you might have to tweak which type of product you're using. So in summary, thanks to the research done by Sask Forage, we know that summer pasture is often deficient in minerals, especially our trace minerals. Not all sources of minerals and vitamins are created equally. And so when comparing specs, remember to consider the ingredient source. And intake is everything. So the best mineral in the world won't do you any good sitting in the feeder. So with that, I'll leave out my contact info. You're welcome to reach out with any questions you might have. And I'll turn it back to Janelle to kind of field any questions we have.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Breanna. So our first question is, as a new producer, where is the best place to start in order to build a proper mineral program?
I would say definitely reach out to whoever your local rep is or your local ag office. A good place to start would be kind of summarizing what you've done in the past, what kind of mineral they've been exposed to, whether it's salt blocks, just kind of get a tally of what you have been using. I'd say the next step is looking at your forage sources. So if we're talking in the fall time, it never hurts to get a few forage samples done and start building a ration that way to build a mineral program around it. I would say going into the summertime, main things would be making sure you're getting enough trace minerals into them. This time of year, I recommend a lot of, higher calcium, moderate phosphorus type minerals. But it never hurts, like I said, it never hurts to just reach out, give someone a call. They'll probably have customers in your area and kind of give you an indication of what's working in your area.
Great, thank you. And then another question. So when you said that cattle do not have nutritional wisdom for getting their mineral needs, is there a formal study behind that? Or is there something that goes into more detail on that concept?
Yeah, I'm sure I could dig up something specifically on that. I remember back in grad school when grazing studies, we always talked about how they had tried to figure out what cows had wisdom for, and essentially they have a taste for salt. We know that they might prefer certain tastes of, a certain type of DDGs over another, but they won't very often balance out their nutritional needs based on it. For example, if they were to get into a barley bin, they'll overconsume for sure. But I can, if you want to reach out to Catherine afterwards or fire me off an email, I can see if I can dig out that paper from grad school.
Excellent. And then one more question. In terms of feed, what would be best for a small cow-calf operation to use hay versus green feed?
Perfect. I guess it would depend what kind of qualities you expect you're going to get. I have a lot of customers who make zero hay because they got frustrated with their hay yields, and they can grow really good quality green feed. You can see green feed that gets adequate protein to, put a lactating cow on. So I would say it kind of depends on your area and what you're used to getting for a feed quality. It's always important to test that feed to know exactly what you're dealing with. It doesn't hurt to have a bit of hay on hand to blend off with a green feed or a silage, but I am seeing a lot more customers move towards silage, cereal, forage-based rations because they can achieve such high yields. That being said, certain areas have really good hay establishment, so there's nothing wrong with the entirely hay diet as well. Just like I said, I'm seeing a lot of people move to cereal forages, and those diets can be balanced very easily as well.
Excellent. So it looks like that's it for questions for right now. So like I said, if another question pops up after this webinar, please don't hesitate to contact Catherine, Breanna, or myself. For any other agriculture-related questions or inquiries, please contact your nearest Saskatchewan Agriculture Regional Office or call the Ag Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377 or visit the website at saskatchewan.ca/agriculture. And then I will remind everyone that part 2 of the webinar series is going to go on this Thursday, April 30th at the same time, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. And the topic of that webinar is going to be on grazing management, including stocking density and some fencing tips. So please contact us if you want a link to register for that webinar if you haven't already. And so with that, I'll give a big thank you to Catherine and Breanna for presenting tonight, and we'll wrap up there. Thanks everyone very much for joining us today, and have a great evening.